Whenever a movie's successful, there's almost always a sequel to follow it up, but in most cases, it's never quite as good as the original.
That's a fact of life. You tell me something I don't know.
Well, the exact opposite can be said about video games, because aside from a few exceptions here and there, video game franchises usually get better with sequels. But video game sequels are usually better because good gameplay is more of a science, whereas good storytelling for movies is more of an art. Figuring out how to create a good gameplay foundation's an art, but once you've got that down, creating a sequel that's better than the original usually just requires doing more of what worked and less of what didn't. But there are a few occasions where sequels to successful video games strike out worse than my dad did the other day in Little League T-Ball. Or even if they are good, they still fail to surpass the original. Which games am I talking about? Well, kick your feet back, turn your Vanilla Ice mixtape down, tell my dad that since he lost the big T-Ball game he owes me $20 by Friday or some guy named Tony's gonna cut my little winky off. Press the subscribe button if you haven't already, and allow me, the world's worst gambler Cameron, to tell you 7 game franchises where the original game was the best entry in the series.
I made a list!
Number 1. Megaman X. I know some of you are thinking this game shouldn't count since there were 6 Mega Man games before it, but there's gonna be other similar situations on this list. And any fan of the Cyan Bomber knows that the X series is a completely different thing.
It's not the same, not the same, not the same.
Sure, the premise of jumping and shooting while moving ahead is the same, but being able to dash and wall jump flip turn things upside down. And with Mega Man 2 being the most popular game in the classic series, seeing as how it made the most improvements over its predecessor, you'd think that Mega Man X2 would have melted the planet or something. But nah, nobody really holds that game in the same regard as the first one. If I'm being honest though, I almost like X2 better than 1. I mean, it gives you the dash right off the bat since it's crucial to the game, but X1 pretty much just hopes you choose Chill Penguin first, and I think that's pretty lame. And not only that, but X2 assumes you played the first game and shoves difficulty straight up your candy ass as soon as the intro stage is over. But what prevents the second Mega Man X game from being my favorite is that the X-Hunters are a little confusing due to their randomness. And aside from X4, none of the other games in the series really came close to touching the first one, regardless of what Mega Man X1 said under oath. But I'm not legally allowed to talk about that any further. Number 2. Okami. Capcom's always had a little bit of a bonnier for the Zelda series, but aside from getting to make a few great 2D games, Nintendo never gave them the keys to Zelda's 3D games. So what did Capcom do? Well, they pretty much made their own Zelda where you attack with a paintbrush instead of a sword and play as a wolf instead of a human, which you might say is copying Twilight Princess, but Okami came out first, so y'all can suck it. I personally wouldn't say Okami's better than 3D Zelda, but there are a lot of people who would. Unfortunately though, the game didn't really sell all that well since it was a late PS2 game, and since ports weren't really considered cool back then, it didn't fare much better on the Wii either. Regardless though, people who have played this game loved it. So you'd think Capcom would be smart enough to realize that the game didn't underachieve for not being fun to play and try again with a sequel. Sadly though, the sequel Okami Den was released on the original DS when the 3DS was already out, so most people just kinda overlooked it. But even though the game was a lot of fun to play and the touchscreen was perfect for the brush, the game just didn't offer as much as the first one, which is to be expected from a DS title. Had the original Okami not existed for comparison, I think this game would have been more popular. But unfortunately, Okami Den never even had a chance at surpassing the original, and we haven't seen a new game ever since. Number 3. Metroid Prime. It took the Metroid series a long time to come to 3D, but with first-person shooters on the 64 holding up about as well as my homemade milk from the same era, I'd say that Metroid Prime was worth the wait. I'd imagine it's pretty hard to take a game that was specifically made for 2D and try to rework everything in 3D while losing as few core elements as possible, but Metroid Prime's probably the best example at a first attempt aside from Bubsy 3D rocking your ass. I didn't play Metroid Prime 2 all that much, but my landlord Ricky said it's not as good as the first one. I did play Metroid Prime 3 all the way to the end though, and then I just kinda stopped. Not cause the game wasn't good or anything, I actually loved it, but I'd still give the edge to Metroid Prime 1 cause you actually felt alone in that game, whereas in Metroid Prime 3 you could just fly wherever you wanted. And you could even talk to other people, and that just doesn't feel very Metroid-y to me. And Metroid Prime Hunters was pretty good for what it was, but it was still just bite-sized Metroid Prime. Maybe Metroid Prime 4 will be better when it comes out in 2067, but until then, Metroid Prime 1's the king of the series. Number 4. Chibirobo. Okay, so I haven't really played a whole lot of Chibirobo, but if I left it off this list, I'd probably get mugged the next time I go to the egg store. But even though I haven't played this series a whole lot, the 30 minutes or so I played on the GameCube game was a lot of fun, and I thought it was really unique. But since this GameCube game came out right before the Wii launched, it was ignored harder than my sexual advances towards my wife. And for some reason, the developers thought the game didn't do well because it wasn't good. And from what I'm told, the feature game strayed further and further away from what made the original a cult classic, instead of just trying to get more eyeballs on it. But that's all I could really get out of my 300 hours of research I did. So until I find the time to play more games in the series, I'm gonna have to leave it at that. Number 5. Luigi's Mansion. Okay, so obviously I'm aware that Luigi's Mansion 3 is coming out by the end of the year this video is being made in, but based on what little we know so far, I'm honestly a little skeptical that it's going to be better than the first one. I'm sure it's going to be great, but the first trailer felt a little bit too lighthearted for me. There is a good chance that Luigi's Mansion 3 will be the best in the series, though, but we're just gonna have to wait and see. Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon was a heck of a mess of fun to be sure, but I much prefer just having one mansion over separate stages. Although, I could see how people might consider revisiting earlier areas as backtracking. There is the Luigi's Mansion arcade game, which is a lot of fun, but for obvious reasons, it's a completely different kind of game. And cause I don't have any friends willing to play through the entire game with me, I've never seen it all the way through anyway. So unless Luigi's Mansion 3 proves me wrong, which it very well might, this video is gonna remain accurate. Number 6. Resident Evil 4. Oh, I already know what you're gonna say about the number 4 being in the title, but you know what?
Time you shut your cake hole, Yoko!
Aside from the story, Resident Evil 4 is far more of a reboot than a sequel in terms of gameplay. No more tank controls, no more being scared, no more puzzles that require any brain cells. And instead of ammo being scarce, it literally comes out of enemies' asses after you kill them. Resident Evil straight up turned into an action series at this point. Don't get me wrong though, Resident Evil 4 is one of my favorite games of all time, but regardless of the number in the title, it's definitely the beginning of a separate series like Metroid Prime. Regardless of what you think of the change of direction though, regardless of how overrated and underrated 5 and 6 are respectively though, I don't think anyone would try peeing in my taco supply for saying that 4 was the first and best action Resident Evil game. Number 7. Banjo Kazooie. For the record, I know I could have also included Conker's Bad Fur Day in this list, but I think it's best we all forget about that episodic reboot altogether. But as far as Banjo Kazooie goes, in my opinion, it's the greatest collectathon platformer of all time. But even if you disagree with me on that, I don't think anybody in the history of the universe would prefer any of the other Banjo games over the first in the series. Banjo Tooie had too much backtracking, and while Grunty's Revenge on the Game Boy Advance was underrated, it was still just too limited to hold a candle to Banjo 1. And then Nuts and Bolts was just Nuts and Bolts. Since Yooka-Laylee was a spiritual successor made by the same people, you could count that as a Banjo game. But that too failed to recapture the magic of the original, which has puzzled some of the world's top scientists and, for some reason, proctologists. But I think the reason for the original Banjo-Kazooie being the best in the series is because of how simple it was kept. Banjo-Tooie and Yooka-Laylee just tried way too hard to make everything bigger and better, when they really just overcomplicated things and created backtracking. The average person could 100% the original Banjo within a few days, and none of the stages were really that big because they didn't really have to be, making this a perfect example of less is more. It remains to be seen at the time of this video whether or not a rare-made Banjo 3 or Yooka-Laylee 2 ever reach enlightenment again. But until that day comes, Banjo-Kazooie's the first and best Banjo game in the history of the universe. Just like today's patrons of the day, Noah Liger and Red Jar are the best humans in the history of the universe. If you want to join these badasses, then consider supporting this channel on Patreon for loot boxes and silly rewards in the mail, or check the merch store out for t-shirts and mugs. And if you want to make cameos in videos, then just send us pictures of videos of you rocking the merch doing whatever you want. What franchises with the best game being the first did I miss though? Do you think any of the games on this list had better sequels? Either way, let me know what you think in the comments below, and as always, I'll pin whatever I find most entertaining or intriguing. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already to prove to the world how big of a badass you are. And if you like and share this video, it really goes a long way to help this channel grow. My name's Cameron, and I'll see you next time.
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty, thank you for your support.